Okay, so get this. President Trump just dropped like a total bombshell. Uh, New tariffs on goods from China, Canada, and Mexico. We're talking news articles, expert analyses, official statements. We've got it all. And here's the really weird part. Canada and Mexico, they hit back right away with their own tariffs. But China's response has been like way more calculated, like they're playing chess or something.
It's pretty wild that he chose to make the announcement like right over a weekend, February 1st and 2nd to be exact.
Talk about a way to kick off the week, right. And he didn't hold back at all 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico, and then on top of that, 10% on everything coming in from China. It's huge.
Officially, the reason he gave was to hold these countries accountable,
Hmm.
for things like the whole immigration issues with Canada and Mexico, and then the flow of fentanyl coming from China, and there's also money laundering concerns also tied to China. But as you mentioned, it's interesting how different everyone's reacting. At Canada and Mexico, they just went straight to retaliation, but China's taking a much more like strategic approach.
Yeah, it's like they're playing completely different games here. So why wouldn't China just immediately slap back with tariffs like the others did?
Well, they did say they condemn the tariffs and promised to take countermeasures, but they've been super vague about the specifics. Their main move so far has been to file a complaint with the World Trade Organization.
The WTO. But doesn't that seem kind of pointless, considering the U.S. has basically, like, what, kneecapped their whole dispute resolution system?
That's what's so interesting about it. See, the WTO is supposed to be the referee for global trade, sets the rules and helps resolve disagreements. But the U.S. has been blocking all the appointments to the WTO's appellate body, which is the part that actually makes the final call on disputes. So right now, the WTO can't actually enforce anything.
So if the WTO is basically on hold, what's the point of China even going to them? Seems more like a move for show than anything else.
Exactly. I think if you look at the big picture, China's in it for the long game. By going to the WTO, they're making themselves look like the ones who are upholding, like, the international order. Well, the U.S. is the one breaking all the rules. It's a pretty smart PR move on the world stage.
Yeah, like they're trying to grab the moral high ground. Makes you wonder if that'll work, though, given China's own, let's say, complicated history with accusations of unfair trade practices.
That's a really good point. It does raise the question of whether this is just like a temporary tactic or maybe it's part of something bigger. We've seen China getting more and more assertive about becoming a global rule maker, and this could be another step in that direction. Maybe they're thinking that in the long run, a system based on rules, even rules they help make, will benefit them more than the U.S. just going it alone.
It's a big gamble for sure. But let's not forget, China also has some serious economic power to throw around. Their economy's way bigger than Canada's or Mexico's, so they're probably feeling a bit more comfortable about weathering any initial storm.
For sure. They definitely have more wiggle room to absorb any short-term economic hits. But it's not just about size, it's also about strategy. The fact that Trump set the tariff rate on China lower than on Canada and Mexico, 10% versus 25%, that suggests to me that he might be more open to negotiating with them.
Maybe he's trying to gain leverage to push through a new trade deal, especially since there were some loose ends from that 2020 agreement.
Could be. And here's where it gets even more confusing. Even with this whole trade war going on, Trump's second term has actually seen some surprisingly, friendly moments between the U.S. and China. There was that phone call between Trump and Xi Jinping that seemed pretty positive. Then you had high-level Chinese officials at his inauguration, and even Trump himself said he'd rather not use tariffs on China.
So is this like a good cop, bad cop routine, or is there actually a chance for them to cooperate amidst all this tension? It's kind of baffling.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated situation with a lot of moving pieces. On the one hand, you've got this trade war that's creating all this tension and distrust. But then on the other hand, there are these back channels open, and maybe even some areas where both sides see a chance to work together.
But let's not forget about the big elephant in the room, or maybe it's a dragon, in this case, the fentanyl issue. It seems like it's a major sticking point for the U.S. and a key reason for these tariffs.
Yeah, you're right. It's a big one, and it's definitely making things worse. The White House is pointing the finger at China for the fentanyl crisis in the U.S., saying they're not doing enough to stop the flow of this drug.
And China's been pushing back pretty hard. They're saying they've actually been leading the way in fighting drug trafficking. They even point out that they were the first country to put all fentanyl-related substances on their controlled substances list back in 2019.
Exactly. And they're being pretty blunt about it. In fact, there's this quote from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that really sums up their perspective. Fentanyl is an issue for the U.S. In the spirit of humanity and goodwill, China has given support to the U.S.'s response to this issue.
It almost sounds like they're saying, hey, this is your problem, not ours, but we're trying to help out. You can definitely feel the tension there.
There's definitely a lot being said between the lines. It's like they're subtly accusing the U.S. of using the fentanyl crisis as a way to cover up what they see as the real goal. Manipulating trade to get an advantage. It just adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
So we've got tariffs flying back and forth, accusations of unfair trade practices, and a global trade system that's basically frozen. It feels like things could get pretty chaotic. So let's bring it back down to earth for a second. What does all this mean for the average person?
Well, this is where things start to get a little worrying. Think of it like a chain reaction. Those tariffs don't just vanish, they keep getting passed along until they eventually push up the prices of everyday things for consumers.
So are we talking about like clothes, electronics, even groceries all getting more expensive? That's going to hit people's wallets hard.
Exactly. And we're not talking about small change here. The Peterson Institute for International Economics has done some calculations, and their estimates are not good. Just the tariffs on Mexico and Canada alone that could cost the U.S. economy up to $200 billion over the next 4 years. And that's not even counting the impact of the China tariffs, which could add another $55 billion hit to the U.S. economy.
Wow, those are some big numbers. And what about the impact on Canada and Mexico? They're not exactly economic powerhouses like the U.S. and China.
No, they're not. And they're probably going to feel the pain even more. The same study predicts that Canada could lose a whopping $100 billion from their economy, and Mexico could see their economy shrink by 2%. Those are some serious blows, especially for a country like Mexico, which is already facing its fair share of economic problems.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture. It seems like everyone loses in a trade war, but some definitely get hit harder than others.
That's usually how it goes. These retaliatory tariffs almost never achieve what they're supposed to. Instead, they just mess up the whole web of global supply chains, hurt businesses of all sizes, and in the end, it's the consumers who are left paying the price.
So what's next? Are we just waiting to see who gives in first in this high-stakes game of chicken?
There are a few ways this could go. Things could keep escalating with more tariffs and retaliation. That would be a disaster. Or maybe everyone will calm down and we'll see a new trade deal. Maybe they'll go back and fix that 2020 agreement.
A new deal would definitely be the best outcome. But what about China? They've been surprisingly quiet so far. What are their options going forward?
Well, they've got a few tricks up their sleeve. They could decide to fight fire with fire and implement their own tariffs to match the U.S., or they could use their control over exports of crucial minerals and technologies. That would be a huge deal. It would disrupt global supply chains everywhere.
It's like they have a nuclear option ready to go if they want to use it.
Exactly. But they also have that moral high ground approach they've been building up. They could keep trying to get international support and paint the U.S. as the bad guy in this trade war. That might pressure the U.S. to change its approach.
So lots of uncertainty and the potential for things to go either way. It's clear that this is far from over and we need to pay close attention.
Absolutely. These trade wars aren't just some abstract economic battles happening on a global chessboard. They have real consequences for people, businesses, and the entire world.
And that brings us to a really important question. What about the human cost? We've been focusing on the economics and the politics, but what about the people whose lives are directly affected by these decisions?
That's something that often gets lost in all the high-level discussions. It's easy to forget that behind the statistics and the political maneuvering, there are real people whose livelihoods, dreams, and futures are on the line.
And that's exactly where we'll pick things up in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll zoom in from the macro to the micro and explore the stories of the individuals, families, and communities who are feeling the ripple effects of these trade wars. So we just spent a lot of time talking about the politics and economics behind this whole trade war, but now I want to shift gears and focus on something really important. The human impact. It's easy to get caught up in all the abstract talk about the economy and global power plays, but at the end of the day, it's real people whose lives are being affected by these decisions.
You're absolutely right. These trade wars aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or something. They're playing out in factories, on farms, and in homes all over the world.
So let's bring it down to earth. How are these tariffs actually impacting people, families, and entire communities?
Well, one of the most immediate and obvious impacts is on workers and industries that are directly hit by these tariffs, like the U.S. steel and aluminum workers, for example. When Trump first imposed tariffs on those imports back in his first term, those industries saw some job gains, at least initially.
Right. The idea was to protect American jobs by making foreign steel and aluminum more expensive, so companies would be more likely to buy American-made products.
Exactly. But like with a lot of things in economics, especially global trade, the reality is much more complicated. While some workers in those specific industries did benefit, the tariffs also had this ripple effect and ended up raising costs for other industries that use those materials, like manufacturing and construction. And that, unfortunately, led to job losses in those sectors.
It's like a domino effect where one action triggers a whole cascade of unintended consequences.
Exactly. And we're seeing a similar thing happening right now with these new tariffs. Take American soybean farmers, for instance. They export a ton of their crop to China, and now China has retaliated with tariffs on agricultural products. So those farmers are getting hit from both sides. They've got lost income because of fewer exports, plus they're dealing with all this uncertainty about the future of their livelihoods.
And on the other side of the world, Chinese consumers are probably facing higher prices for those soybeans, which could mean higher food prices overall. It seems like everyone ends up getting caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate reality of trade wars. They create these ripple effects that extend way beyond the specific industries being targeted, and often it's the people who are already struggling, the ones with the least amount of financial security, who end up bearing the brunt of it.
I imagine small businesses are especially vulnerable in this situation. They probably don't have the same resources as bigger corporations to handle these sudden price hikes.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Small businesses usually operate with really thin margins, so any disruption to their supply chains or any increase in the cost of materials they need can be absolutely devastating. There have been reports of small businesses in the U.S. really struggling to cope with the higher prices they're now having to pay for goods they import from China.
It's not just the economic impact, though, right? You also have to consider the stress, the anxiety, and the uncertainty that people are dealing with. These tariffs inject a lot of instability into people's lives, affecting not just their finances, but also their mental and emotional well-being.
Absolutely. Imagine being a small business owner who has poured their heart and soul into building their company. And then suddenly, you're facing the possibility of having to shut everything down because of forces that are totally beyond your control. That's an incredible amount of stress to carry. Or imagine being a farmer who's worked the land for generations, carrying on a family legacy, and now their entire livelihood is at risk because of a trade war happening thousands of miles away. It's a heavy burden that weighs on individuals, families, and entire communities.
It's a reminder that these trade wars aren't just abstract political games or numbers on a balance sheet. They have a real impact on people's dreams, their aspirations, their ability to support their families and build a future for themselves.
Exactly. And it's not just about the immediate impact either. These tariffs can have long-term consequences that ripple outward, shaping communities for years to come. If businesses are forced to close and jobs disappear, it can create a downward spiral of economic decline, people moving away, and a sense of hopelessness that can be really hard to overcome.
Yeah, it can create this feeling of despair that affects everything in a community: schools, healthcare, social services, the overall quality of life.
You're right. And it's important to remember that these impacts aren't evenly distributed. Some regions and communities are much more vulnerable than others, depending on how much they rely on global trade and how resilient their local economies are. A community that's heavily dependent on manufacturing jobs that are tied to global supply chains, for example, is going to be hit much harder than a community with a more diverse range of industries.
So, while some people might see these trade wars as just battles between countries, the reality is much more complicated and grounded in the everyday lives of people who are trying to make a living, support their families, and build a future for themselves.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for policymakers to think about the human cost of these decisions. They need to go beyond the simple economic calculations and consider the potential social and human consequences. We need more thoughtful and comprehensive analysis that takes into account the full range of impacts, not just the ones that are easy to measure.
Yeah, it's about moving beyond this idea that it's a zero-sum game, where one country wins and the other one loses. We need to start thinking about trade in a way that benefits everyone, that creates opportunities for shared prosperity, not just for a select few.
And on a more individual level, I think it's important to stay informed, to have meaningful conversations about these issues, and to support organizations that are helping the people who are most affected by these trade wars. Ultimately, it's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness, and understanding that we're all in this together.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started by asking why China reacted so differently to these tariffs, and we've uncovered all these layers of economic strategy, political maneuvering, and most importantly, human stories of resilience, struggle, and uncertainty. It's clear that these trade wars are much more than just abstract battles on a global stage.
They're having a profound impact on people's lives, and will continue to feel the effects for years to come. It's a reminder that economics is really about people, about the choices we make and the consequences those choices have for others.
I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to think critically about these complex issues, to engage in meaningful conversations, and to consider the human stories behind the headlines. Because at the end of the day, it's those stories, the stories of individuals and communities that matter most.
I agree. Now, we've talked about the economic and social consequences, the impact on businesses and communities, but there's another layer to explore here, one that goes even deeper: the personal stories of individuals who are caught in the crosshairs of this trade war.
Let's hear those stories. In part 3 of this deep dive, we're going to hear from some people on the front lines and explore the personal journeys of those who are navigating the challenges and uncertainties of this global trade war. So we've looked at, the whole economic chessboard and all the political stuff happening with this trade war. But now I think it's time to actually hear from the people who are most affected by it. The ones whose voices often get lost in all the noise.
Yeah, you're so right. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, like tariffs and negotiations and all that. But we can't forget about the actual people whose lives are being directly impacted by all of this. Their stories are the ones that really show us the true cost of these trade wars.
Exactly. So let's meet some of these people. What are some of the stories that have really stood out to you in your research?
One that really stuck with me was about this small business owner in the Midwest, a woman named Sarah. She built this really successful furniture company from scratch, employed about 20 people from her town. She had a reputation for making high-quality stuff at fair prices. Her business was doing great.
Sounds like the American dream.
It totally was. But then these tariffs hit, and the price of the wood she used, which she imported, just skyrocketed. I mean, she tried to absorb the extra costs for as long as she could, but eventually she had to raise her prices. And then, of course, sales dropped, and she was left with this impossible choice: lay off workers or risk losing her entire business.
Man, I can't even imagine the pressure she must have been under.
It was a constant struggle. She told reporters that she would lie awake at night just agonizing over what to do. You see, these weren't just employees to her. They were her friends, her neighbors, people she'd known for years. The thought of having to let them go, to mess up their lives because of something she had no control over, was just heartbreaking for her.
It really shows you how far-reaching the effects of these tariffs can be. It's not just about numbers in a report. It's about real people's lives, their families, their ability to take care of their basic needs.
Absolutely. And Sarah's story is just one of many. I read about this farmer in Iowa who had to sell off a chunk of his land because he couldn't make ends meet after trying to put tariffs on soybeans. And then there's this family in Maine who are struggling to pay for their daughter's medication. It's life-saving medication because the price went up due to tariffs on pharmaceutical ingredients coming from China. These stories are happening all over the country and really all over the world.
It makes you wonder, what happens to these people when all the political stuff is over? Do their lives just go back to normal?
That's a really good question, and is one that deserves a lot more attention.
Yeah.
The truth is, the impact of these trade wars can last for a long time. Lost jobs, businesses shutting down, communities being devastated. These are wounds that can take years, maybe even generations to heal.
And it's not just the economic damage either. There's also this loss of trust, a feeling of betrayal that can stick around long after the tariffs are gone.
Exactly. Think about that furniture maker, Sarah. Even if she manages to keep her business going, this whole experience has probably shaken her faith in the system and the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, things will work out.
That's a pretty sobering thought. We talk a lot about the economic and political fallout from these trade wars, but the psychological and social impacts are just as important, maybe even more so.
Right. We need to remember that people's lives aren't just pieces on a chessboard to be moved around. They have hopes and dreams and fears. They're vulnerable. And when those things are ignored or sacrificed for the sake of some political strategy or economic gain, the damage can be really serious.
So what can we do about it? How do we try to lessen the human cost of these trade wars?
Well, on the policy side, it's crucial for the people making these decisions to think about the bigger picture, to go beyond the immediate economic calculations and really consider the potential impact on people and society. We need more well-rounded analysis that takes into account all of the potential effects, not just the ones that are easy to quantify.
Yeah, it's about moving away from this I win, you lose mentality when it comes to trade. We need to start thinking about it in a way that benefits everyone, that creates opportunities for everyone to prosper, not just a select few.
And on a more individual level, I think it's important to stay informed, to talk about these issues with each other, and to support groups that are helping those who are most affected by these trade wars. At the end of the day, it's about recognizing that we're all human, we're all connected, and we're all in this together.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with this question, why did China react so differently to these tariffs? And we've uncovered all this stuff about economic strategies, political games, and most importantly, human stories of resilience, struggle, and uncertainty. It's clear that these trade wars are way more than just some kind of abstract battles happening on a global scale.
They're changing people's lives in really profound ways, and we're going to be feeling the effects for a long time. It's a reminder that economics is really about people, about the choices we make, and how those choices affect other people.
That's a great point. Well, I hope this deep dive has made you think about these complex issues, maybe start some conversations, and really consider the human side of things, because at the end of the day, it's the stories of individuals and communities that really matter.
Absolutely. Well said. And as we move forward in this world that's more and more interconnected, let's remember that empathy, understanding, and working together to create prosperity for everyone are key to building a better and fairer future for all of us.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into Trump's trade tariffs. Until next time, this is the Deep Dive signing off.